everyone, Michael Kofman here, host of the Russia Contingency. We at War on the Rocks decided to give you all a sneak preview of my most recent podcast. Tune in to hear the first 20 minutes of my conversation with Bill Wohlforth, and if you like what you hear, consider becoming a member at warontherocks.com/membership. Welcome back to another episode of the Russia Contingency. I'm Michael Kofman, and today I have with me an honored guest. Actually, I am a guest of his because I'm visiting for a week at Dartmouth University up in New Hampshire, and I've had the opportunity to give some talks here, and I'm spending time with my longtime colleague, Bill Wohlforth. Bill is a professor here and has been long established in the field of international relations, international security. He has written countless articles, many books, and remains sort of an avid contributor. I've enjoyed conversations with him over the years. And I want to just kind of open up a bit and talk about something that's been on my mind. We're going to have hopefully a broad-ranging discussion today, and we're going to step out of the immediacy of what's happening in this war and talk about big picture and history and how it relates to topics and international security and U.S. power and interests. So one of the first questions I have is that, Bill, historically, you sort of professionally grew up at a time of the Cold War and the transition from the Cold War into whatever the post-Cold War period is. And the Soviet Union and then post-Soviet Russia were very, very much central to that and had been very much central to discussions in international security. And I'm kind of curious how you reflect on the kind of inflection point we seem to be at this stage with this war. And what does it mean to you when you look at it?
Well, first, let me say, Mike, how happy I am to be able to join you on this podcast. And I want your listeners all to know that I was a huge Kofman fan long before this war occurred. As you know, I assigned lots of your material to my students in my Russian foreign policy class. So I just want to have that there on the record. Yeah, I got going in the study of international security during the Cold War, during what was then called the New Cold War, the intensification of that rivalry that occurred in the mid-'80s, early mid-'80s, and only began to wane under Gorbachev. And so the signal event of my career was the unexpected end of that struggle, the Cold War, that everybody thought was going to keep going, and then the equally unexpected collapse of the Soviet Union. Then we had a period that some people began to call unipolarity. It lasted a long time, and people sort of forgot about great power competition. And very few people predicted that Russia would become a pugnacious, seemingly resurgent actor in international politics, that Russia's dissatisfaction with its position in the international system would manifest itself in a major conventional war in the heart of Europe. So in kind of a weird sense, the failures of international relations scholars to foresee what was coming and the centrality of Russia to the global security situation kind of bookend my career, both at the beginning and now, if I may say, towards the end of it.
So let me chime in on this. Another colleague of yours in the field, another academic, Paul Post, he has some really good comments and threads over the years. And one thing he's pointing to that I think is, it's kind of true and it's worth discussing is how much of international security, whether it's theory, whether it's conceptual development, over the course of kind of this past century, has been so heavily influenced by the study of wars in which Russia features fairly prominently as an antagonist, right? Militarized disputes, in the Cold War, right? And deterrence theory and a lot of other things really come out of this time period. So it's heavily premised on the sort of bipolar division of the world and the competition between United States and Western countries and the communist bloc. And Russia still figures, much less so, but still figures fairly significantly as in European security as an antagonist or as a country that sort of becomes a halfway house, never makes this imperial transition, never abandons the imperial mindset. And I know you've heard me say before that I see a lot of these wars as principally wars of Soviet succession, that the Soviet Union is still collapsing slowly, and that folks overly interpreted the collapse of the Soviet Union as an event more so than a process, which is what it really is. But I kind of want to throw this joke at you, and I've made it before at times that a lot of international security sometimes feels like failed Russia area studies because it's so central. It's so centrally focused on cases and things that involved Russia or the Soviet Union. I mean, do you think there's some truth to that and some truth to Paul Post's commentary on this?
Of course, I think it's true because when I was a graduate student, I decided I had a choice. I could either study statistics and game theory, or I could study another language and try to gain some area expertise. And of course, I took the latter course. I studied Russian, went to the Soviet Union, went to Leningrad State University to study Russian, et cetera, et cetera. So I was very gratified when a non-Russia expert, an IR scholar of great renown, Paul Post, noted statistically how prominent Russia is in all of our data sets on interstate war. Basically, whether you look at militarized interstate disputes or great power war, whatever you want to do, Russia is just a highly active, belligerent, great power. And people who study, this show is called the Russia Contingency. So the Russia Contingency, in some sense, is trying to figure out when this Russia's issue, which is a country that has for 400 years kind of punched above its weight in international politics, when that's going to come to the fore in terms of violent conflict. And so someone who is equipped with knowledge about general international relations, scholarship about international security, things like deterrence, things like balancing and alliances, you know this literature, but also knows a ton about Russia, is well equipped to handle some of the questions that we're going to face, and including the two that we have been talking about, the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union, and then the wars of the Soviet succession and the current war that we're seeing.
Yeah, so someone who I think grew up professionally, much more in the literature of 90s and 2000s, I professionally went this whole period at a time where all the articles were basically saying that Russia's dead. We're not going to have to deal with Russia anymore. Russia's gone as a power. And it seems we go through cycles of these pieces, right? Russia typically either exists in a state of being 4 feet tall or 12 feet tall. And I do fear that, after this war, there's been a lot of discrediting of Russian military power and Russian military capability. And the Russian economy is often kind of superficially assessed, as you just said. It tends to punch well above its weight historically. Let's say compared to countries like China, who I feel typically really punch well below their weight if you look at their foundations of power, right? There's just honest opinion. China analysts and experts are welcome to come at me and fight me on this. But so my sense of it is that we may be seeing a genuine transition where after this, at least for some period of time, and this is a debatable point, Russia will become less relevant to the conversation. A lot of folks are very much focused on China and the Indo-Pacific. I don't know if that's going to last very long because Russia has this immense capacity to hang around, and if it has one distinct trait as a power, it's the ability to reconstitute itself even after state collapse and then come back as a meaningful actor, maybe a second-tier power typically, but a meaningful actor in international politics long after being written off. Right after people are written off. I don't know how you look at this. I think you have a much better historical perspective looking at this timeline.
Well, you'd start with historical narrative that you could go all the way back, but let's say we just look at the 20th century. It was Russia's perceived weakness, but then the fear of its gaining strength. So perceived weakness after the Russo-Japanese War, but German fears of its growing strength, that were a critical precipitating cause of the First World War. Then you have the sense of Russian weakness in the 1930s, after Stalin's purges of the army, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You know that whole story. These ebbs and flows of Russian/Soviet power figure in the ebbs and flows of great power rivalry, and in some case in wars. And what we're seeing right now is that even though China is, by everyone's acknowledgement, sort of a materially stronger state by most measures we can think of, except a few military ones, it's been Russia that is truly responsible for bringing great power competition back onto the agenda. Sure, we have all kinds of issues with China, but who's the one that's actually been out over its skis, if I can use a New Hampshire term, in terms of pushing things both on cyber, on subversion, on propaganda, and now on the willingness to unleash such a devastating war in Europe?
So this is a very fair point because if you look in terms of base measures of power's potential, right, China looks so strong, and we can debate how well rated it is, but Russia's far more active, much more engaged as a revisionist. You had a Russian deployment, to the Middle East to basically check policy preferences of U.S. there. You've had far more wars fought by Russia since the collapse of the Soviet Union. A lot of folks don't remember the wars of the 1990s, but there were quite a few that Russia got involved in, intervened in. There are a whole host of conflicts in the 2000s, right? The Russia-Georgia War, the initial invasion, annexation of Crimea, the Russian intervention in Syria, and what have you. And then following even, Russian intervention via Wagner mercenaries in Libya. And the list is actually quite extensive. Most importantly, Russia is a state that has attempted to invade not just its neighbor, but what is secondarily the largest country in Europe outside of Russia, Ukraine, and with maximalist war aims, right? It's tried to engage in a form of revisionism that China simply hasn't. And so there's a fair argument to be said that, okay, maybe this will be kind of the death knell of Russian military power for some time. But I'm curious, from your point of view, you made some pretty interesting arguments recently with Steve Brooks, and the thrust of the arguments both deal with propensity for revisionism. To what extent can other states challenge the United States, challenge the international order, and revise their circumstances? And also how we view the state of the United States and the balance of power. Some people think the United States is in decline, right? Others don't. Some people think that China is a much more powerful adversary than the Soviet Union. Others do not, and have a very good, I think, interesting argument as to why that's the case. And I was wondering maybe take a minute and lay out some of your thoughts. There's a good recent Foreign Affairs article that Bill and Steve wrote together on the subject.
Well, thanks for raising that. I will just say you did leave one question on the table, and it's good you did, because it's really a question for you and other guests that you've had, like Steve Kotkin and people who spend their lives studying Russia, which is really not just whether Russia will have the material capacity to regenerate itself, but whether its interest in doing so, whether its insistence on its global role, whether its understanding of itself as a great power is going to be revised in any way in response to what happens in Ukraine. I mean, most people I know who study Russia think that this understanding of its role in the world, of its status, is many, many, many centuries old, and it's not going to be dislodged easily. And if that's the case, then there will be a way. I mean, there'll be the will for Russia to reconstitute itself. The question is whether there'll be a way. But getting to that article and getting to the distribution of power in the world, yeah, we think that, as controversial and crazy as it's probably going to sound to many of your listeners, the world is still closer to unipolarity than it is to bi or multipolarity. And the multipolarity thing is easy because polarity is counting up great powers that are roughly equal. And if you're going to count great powers that are roughly equal after China and Russia, like who do you mention? I mean, after China and the United States, kind of who do you mention? The others are in a different category. But thinking about the system in terms of what the way you put it is very, very probative. How hard it is to revise the system. How easy it is it to defend the existing status quo. And on those metrics, what Brooks and I try to establish in that relatively short article, at least short for academics, is that if you compare this to previous systems, bipolarity and multipolar systems of the past, the revisionist threats, like the plausible changes that China or Russia can make to the international system, pale in significance compared to the feared kinds of changes, the changes that we feared were possible by revisionist actors in past international systems. And you asked about the Soviet Union compared to China. I'm sorry, Gen X, the Soviet Union was a really, really capable actor in one way, in many ways, but in one way that really, really mattered a lot. It had a really large, really powerful army sitting in a place where it was physically close to what was then the world's most important technological and industrial power center. This is what George Kennan was talking about. This is what all the framers of American Cold War strategy were talking about. A credible fear that if the United States didn't do something, its entire international position could be destroyed by Soviet power. Add to that a global ideology that really had appeal around the world, that had appeal, genuine appeal, not just like, oh, I'm pissed off at the liberal world order, but an actual ideology. And you start looking at an actor that in terms of its status as a pole still had a lot more behind it than I see today in China.
I want to add a bit to that. First, I think one of the challenges that it's part of the debate as to whether the situation between U.S. and China is a Cold War, the Cold War. Can't be the Cold War because it's a distinct period of history, but is it a Cold War? And how does it compare? I think one thing folks forget is that the reason the Soviet Union was such a significant adversary for the United States is, first, there was a real vacuum of power created by World War II that essentially destroyed the other powers on the scene. You still had Britain and France, but they were very much in decline, and so they created very different contexts and conditions for the competition, where the Soviet Union had a lot more opportunity, both ideological opportunity and opportunity for revisionism in that environment. You didn't have such fixed structures with alliances, with big status quo states and what have you. NATO was created. It was created to deal with the Soviet Union, but didn't exist in that moment. And the second was that the Soviet Union had an actual coalition of states that it was leading, meaning not coalition. Sure, it coerced the Warsaw Pact, but there was sort of a communist bloc. There were other communist states like China, and so the United States felt a challenge to the sort of model of socioeconomic development and political development that was advancing. There were real challengers on the scene at that time. And it's not clear that China, that sort of authoritarian state, largely state-dominated capitalism is really such a great contender. There's always a challenge in the debate between liberalism and illiberalism. You can kind of define liberalism, but the antithesis to something is not in of itself a viable political ideology that can be advanced. Does that make sense? It's not a coherent set of tenets or concepts. But to get to your question on Russia that you sort of asked me, so I think for Russia and Russian military power, it will take quite a bit of time. I think it will take at least a decade, and I do believe that it's not a matter of if, but a question of when. I think it'll take quite a significant amount of time for Russia to recover from this. That said, a decade is actually a very short amount of time for anyone who does strategy or defense planning. It's often the shortest timeline on which we tend to do defense planning, to believe it. 10 years will come and go very quickly. And I think a lot of countries or folks I talk to in the Baltics and Poland, amongst Nordic countries, they understand that and appreciate it, that however this war ends, to whatever extent Russian military power is destroyed, that they're likely to be left with a state that still has a lot of the same drives and imperatives, might even have a different leader, but not a fundamentally different system, and that the state will eventually recover some degree of economic and military power, and that Europe remains a secondary theater in U.S. grand strategy, which is a big change from what Europe has been, when you think about it, in U.S. strategy, since pretty much the inception of the United States. I think that's a fair argument, right? Would you not agree that up until about a decade ago, kind of the primary sort of geographic focus of U.S. strategy and thinking has been Europe since the inception of this country?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, there's been periods of an American foreign policy that was absolutely fixated upon and fascinated with East Asia, in particular with China. But in terms of actual commitments, in terms of where the money and where the attention went, Europe's been at the forefront of the American imagination strategically for a very long time.
Yeah, I mean, even if we think about the United States becoming a great power and U.S. expansionism in the Pacific and the Philippines, that's derivative of the Spanish-American War, right? So the way by which we become much more of a Pacific power, in many respects, we get there because of the war we have with a dying European power, right? Even that history, I think lends itself more to the interactions between U.S. and European powers at the time. But so my sense of Russian power is that we're going to go through another period. There'll be a whole spate of writing and articles that say Russia's dead and it's on its way out again. And at a certain point, Russia will recover. It may not recover to what it had been, or parts of the system may change. It may come back as a power with a sort of different balance between fairly anemic and weak economic power relative to its military power, right? As I've said in other podcasts, Russia's really spending that Soviet military legacy it inherited, that equipment, those capabilities. That's what's probably not going to change. That's just my own assumption. I don't like essentialist arguments, but what's probably not going to change is the pursuit of status by Russian leaders, often status beyond Russian actual means, that is foundations of Russian power. And this is the more interesting and contestable argument, the pursuit of a geopolitical space where Russian interests predominate outside of Russia's borders. And each Russian and Soviet leader, at least that I've studied or observed, has had their own definition of what that geopolitical space has been, right? For Brezhnev, it might have been the entire Warsaw Pact, right? Half of Europe. For Gorbachev, it might have been not the Warsaw Pact, and he was willing to let go for all sorts of reasons, but it was, let's say, the Soviet Union, And for Putin, it might be Ukraine and Belarus, or another state, but not, let's say, the entire former Soviet Union. I know folks don't like that term, but it's contextually relevant here. So in whatever iterations that Russia's had so far of leadership, pretty much every leader has sought some sort of geopolitical space beyond Russia's borders, a space where Russian interests predominate and Russia has influence, and that to some extent leads them to try to impose limited sovereignty on their neighbors. Do you think that's a fair statement? Thanks again for listening. If you want to hear the rest of this conversation, consider becoming a member by going to warntherocks.com/membership.